So I have a twofold life update for you April 2021 listeners. Our baby Evan has entered the stage where he likes to laugh at himself in the mirror, laugh while being thrown and spun up in the air, fixate on my wife's sticker-covered water bottle, and grab anything that makes noise. He is closing in on his half-birthday, and he still remains the happiest baby I've ever known. And believe it or not, I've held a lot of babies in my lifetime. The other update is that I left my casino's Texas Hold'em tables in the black for the first time. I cannot say enough good things about the Daniel Negreanu class on poker and now 10-time world champion Phil Ivey's courses on poker that I've watched and rewatched on Masterclass's platform. Both Ivey and Negreanu's classes have helped me establish sound fundamentals and even some advanced technique in my Texas Hold'em game. Those are only two of the scores of courses available on the Masterclass platform. Grow yourself professionally or in your hobbies and support the show by using the link in the show notes. Now, to our show.
This is Forgotten Wars.
Last episode you heard about General Gataker, or trolled later by his men as General Backaker, about how he forgot 600 of his men on the field at Stormberg. Spoiler alert, a sense of deja vu will come over you as you hear about what happened at the Battle of Magersfontein to the Scandinavian Corps. Wait, the Scandinavian Corps? What could anyone from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, or Finland have to do with this war? About 50 men who immigrated from the Scandinavian region to work around Pretoria and Johannesburg, many of them to work in the gold mines, would form a volunteer corps. The Transvaal did not obligate these migrants to take up arms, but nevertheless they took up arms for the Boers, just 2 weeks before the South African War began to engulf the region. These Finns, Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes elected the son of a Swedish missionary to Zululand, Johannes Flugare, as their field cornet. This volunteer corps was forgotten in the night, and in less than 2 hours, the British captured or killed almost every single man of this Scandinavian volunteer corps. How did this happen?
Under the British flag, you will have everything you desire, but that flag will continue to fly over the land.
Over the land, maybe. Over the people, never. You will see me in the field, fighting for our independence, long after you and your party who make war with your mouths have fled the country.
I don't think the Boers will have a chance.
Disarm your blacks. Act the part of a white man in a white man's war.
Civilized war is awful.
20 miles south of Kimberley, Black Week continued with the second of 3 British military disasters. Methuen, still set on keeping his promise to relieve the besieged town of Kimberley, now threw 15,000 men at where he thought Boers would be on December 11th. Had he waited longer, Methuen could have used the observation balloon that General Buller sent by rail. To read more about these war balloons used in the South African War, check out the article I just posted to the Forgotten Wars site before it goes behind a paywall. The link will be in the show notes. Instead of waiting for Buller's balloon, and for the favorable weather to use the balloon, Methuen relied on the same spotty scouting as before. As we mentioned last episode, the Boers constructed a 12-mile defensive line below the koppies of Magersfontein. The Boers camouflaged this line so well that British scouts from a mile away could not see the trap that Methuen would march into. I'll pull selectively from Fransjohan Pretorius' description of the defensive war alignment. Quote, the Boer line stretched in a northwesterly direction from Moss Drift in the Mader River, past Magersfontein Kop, and beyond Longerberg. Close to the Mader River, De la Rey's men formed the left flank. To their right were the Kruenstadt, Heilbrunn, Bethlehem, Lady Brandt, and Vicksburg commandos. The Scandinavian Corps was posted in front of them to cover the plains to the southeast of Magersfontein Kop. End quote. In trenches below the Magersfontein Kop lay other commandos. Other Free State and Transvaal Boers formed the right flank. Contrary to what you might have heard, trenches did not emerge for the first time at Magersfontein. Trenches were used at least as early as the Crimean War, nearly 50 years before. But De la Rey did distinguish himself as a superior tactician by having these trenches dug in front of Magersfontein's hills. Methuen made his intentions to attack clear on December 10th when he shelled the hills around Magersfontein Kop. Kus de la Rey lay miles away from the battle, recuperating from a shoulder wound. 33 British guns and 15,000 soldiers were about to clash with 8,000 Boers and 10 of their guns. Before 1 a.m. on December 11th, Methuen's force advanced through pouring rain and mud, many of them gripping guide ropes. Their goal? Take Magersfontein Kop by daybreak. Then the ambient sound, the force that grounded their observation balloon hours prior, the rain, stopped at 4 a.m. And then Pakenham writes, quote, there was a great roaring in the ears, as though a dam had burst its walls. End quote. The Boers opened fire from their concealed trenches, not from 1,400 yards away, not from 1,000 yards away, but from only 400 yards away. The British A Company of the Black Watch charged with fixed bayonets until Boer bullets drove them to the ground. 2 days before this battle, Major General Andy Wauchope finished an interview with Methuen and told Methuen's chief staff officer, quote, I do not like the idea of this night march. Wauchope was no coward. Some say that Wauchope sustained wounds in every battle he fought in. But for some reason, even with the chief staff officer's encouragement, Wauchope did not share his concerns about the 12:30 a.m. night march with Methuen. Now, leading his men from the front in the heat of the Battle of Magersfontein, Wauchope yelled to his cousin, Lieutenant A.G. Wauchope, "This is fighting, A.G." Then General Wauchope ordered Brits under his direct command to extend their line. Then he was shot dead. Lieutenant Colonel Coode took command. But Boer bullets took his life before he could lead anything. The next lieutenant colonel in command didn't know he was technically in charge until the next day. Chaos reigned for a time. Some Highlanders then launched an attack on Magersfontein Kop from the southeast, where they ran into the Scandinavian Corps. Highlanders here met success because the Boers forgot the Scandinavian Corps. You see, at 2 a.m. on December 11th, General Cronje ordered more forward posts like the ones held by the Scandinavian Corps to be abandoned. Somehow, this order never reached the Scandinavian Corps. So there they sat, isolated far in front of the rest of the Boers. When the Boers first opened fire elsewhere along their defensive line at 4 a.m., the Scandinavians sat so far forward that they had a direct line of fire into the Highland Brigade's right flank. The Scandinavian Corps took advantage of that line of fire and incurred the wrath of twice as many Highlanders charging with fixed bayonets. In 90 minutes, the Scandinavians were almost wiped out. The Scandinavian Corps suffered the highest percentage of casualties of any war commando that day. Only 6 of the Scandinavians escaped to Boer lines behind them. About half of those who didn't escape were killed. The other half, captured. General Cronje lost about 100 of his 8,000-man force in the Battle of Magersfontein, a quarter of those killed from the Scandinavian Corps. Their field cornet Flugare was one of those casualties. About the time that the Scandinavian Corps was being finished off, a duty officer in Kimberley finally sighted a British observation balloon at 5:55 a.m. near the scene of the battle. Some of the British Black Watch did reach Magersfontein Kop, only to be driven back down by Boer bullets, and even some British artillery. At 8 a.m., most of the Highland Brigade lay pinned down between 100 and 600 yards away from the Boer positions. There they lay in the blazing sun, without food and water, being swarmed by ants. Sound familiar? British artillery, though, performed well enough to prevent more Brits from being picked off and forced into a chaotic retreat. Just when it looked like Lieutenant General Henry Colville would break through the Boer right flank, Piet Cronje sent his brother, General Andries Cronje, with 500 men to check this British advance. When another small body of Highlanders stumbled onto a gap in the Boer line, they ran into General Piet Cronje himself and some other Boers. Those Brits were quickly killed or captured. Then Boers in the center began to flank the Highland Brigade's right and brought the heaviest hail of bullets upon the Brits for the entire battle. Part of the brigade began an orderly retreat at 1 p.m., but this retreat spread wildly through the ranks until an avalanche of British soldiers fled. One officer described the retreat like this, quote, "I saw a sight I hope I may never see again. Men of the Highland Brigade running for all they were worth. Others cowering under bushes, behind the guns, some lying under their blankets. Officers running about with their revolvers in their hands, threatening to shoot them, urging on some, kicking on others. Staff officers galloping about, giving incoherent and impracticable orders." End quote. But again, the Boers did not come out of their positions to rout retreating Brits. Brits who were pinned down too close to the Boer trenches waited until dark or even morning. Methuen saw about 1,000 of his men killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, the Highland Brigade taking the brunt of these casualties. Methuen's force licked their wounds and resupplied at Modder River. Methuen wrote shortly after, quote, "There must be a scapegoat, so I must bear my fate like a man, holding my tongue." End quote. Another British observation balloon took to the sky the next day and dispelled any hopes of a Boer retreat. Cronje's force had extended and deepened their defensive lines. Black Week would conclude on December 15th in Natal. Two characters take center stage on this day. General Redvers Buller led the largest army corps in British history up to that point, 40,000 men. Sir Evelyn Wood, who served under Buller before, described Buller as careful of his men's lives and reckless of his own, and untiring and unflinching. Churchill described Buller as more aloof but sensible. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, author of the Sherlock Holmes series, described Buller as a heavy, obdurate, inexplicable man. Buller didn't distinguish himself during his youth. He stood tall, broad, and strong when at age 18 he received his commission in the 60th Regiment, King's Royal Rifle Corps, and then was in India 6 months later. When he saw his first action in the 1860 China War, something happened to Redvers that changed him for the rest of his career. A horse kicked Buller in the mouth and knocked out his front teeth. From then on, Redvers spoke less clearly with a lisp. Buller was promoted to lieutenant in 1862, but still showed little interest in perfecting anything related to being a leader. Buller did show bravery in battle, but no brilliance or studiousness. He showed more interest in billiards and card playing. But then Buller reluctantly accepted a colonel's request to be a battalion adjutant. It was in this role that Buller discovered his natural ability as a military administrator. Buller caught Sir Garnet Wolseley's eye in the Red River expedition against a rebel in Manitoba. Then Buller firmly established himself in the Wolseley ring, serving as an intelligence officer in the Ashanti War of 1873. Then, in the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, Lieutenant Colonel Buller commanded the Frontier Light Horse in an attack on a Zulu stronghold at Globane Mountain. He lost 93 of his 400 white troops, partly because of vague instructions he gave. But Buller won a Victoria Cross for the bravery he showed in carrying many wounded men away in front of advancing Zulu and covering a British retreat. Buller played a prominent role in the final battle that sealed the Zulu defeat at Ulundi. Buller then served as Queen Victoria's aide-de-camp, then again in Africa as Wolseley's chief of staff during the Gordon Relief Expedition. About this experience, Fransjohan Pretorius writes, quote, "Although again displaying physical courage, his hesitant and indecisive conduct as a commander of the desert force attracted little attention at the time, and he continued to ascend the ladder of military success." End quote. Buller became a general in 1896 and was appointed commander-in-chief of armed forces that would go to South Africa if necessary. As you already know, British leadership saw it as necessary in late 1899. Buller did something unusual before he arrived in South Africa. He had many self-doubts, even some degree of premonition. Buller wrote his brother before arriving in South Africa. Buller wrote, quote, "I am in the tightest place I have ever been in. I think if I should fail, that it is fair that my family should know afterwards what I have to say in my own defense." End quote. In this letter, Buller blamed certain politicians for future defeats on the battlefield before he even suffered them. Buller laid particular blame on the head of Lansdowne, the Secretary of State for War. You already heard recently about how Buller had to change his original plan. His original plan to steamroll his 40,000-man Army Corps through the Cape Colony to Kimberley, then through the Orange Free State to Bloemfontein, then through the Transvaal to Pretoria, and then to Natal, where in theory those British forces would have already watched many Boers slip away to deal with Buller's advance on their republics. You heard about Buller splitting his force up and heading personally to Natal while leaving Methuen to lead the push eastward from the Cape Colony to Kimberley. When news reached Buller's ear that the British had met disaster at Stormberg and at Magersfontein, Buller used this news to inform a terrible decision. We will get to that decision soon. What I will tell you is that morale skyrocketed when Buller reached Natal. British rank and file knew Buller to be brave and knew Buller to move heaven and earth to see they could get their letters from home. 37-year-old Louis Botha stood 6 feet tall and broad-shouldered with a tightly trimmed beard, a descendant of Huguenot immigrants to the Cape Colony. Louis grew up in a family of 13 children. Louis grew up speaking Zulu and Sotho languages better than he did English. He fired a rifle as soon as he was strong enough to as a child. Louis fought against and alongside Zulu on different occasions growing up. Botha fought as part of a Boer commando in 1884, that helped establish Dini Zulu as the King of the Zulu. 2 years later, Louis married Annie Emmett, a lady of Irish descent. Louis became a successful farmer and served on the Transvaal Volksraad as a progressive member. Louis held out for peace with the British as long as he thought he could. Fransjohan Pretorius writes that the Volksraad granted the franchise to Uitlanders with at least 7 years' residence on Botha's suggestion. But eventually, when it looked like peace was out of reach with the British, Botha took up arms again. Botha emerged even more as a prodigy when he served ably as one of Lucas Meyer's commandants at the Battle of Talana Hill. Botha replaced Meyer after the Battle of Ladysmith, a relative youth among much older Boer generals. Botha was beloved by his men. We left Botha and Joubert's former force in episode 1.27, building concealed fortifications near the Tugela River. It is to this scene we will return. Near Colenso, Botha operated from a tent captured from Simmons's camp in the earlier Battle of Dundee. Botha kept a packing case and a stretcher chair in the tent that remained open to the humblest Boer. Pakenham writes, quote, "When an elderly burgher entered, Botha would give up the chair to him and sit on the ground. There he sat, as a procession of visitors tramped through the tent. He ate, drank, slept, and wrote his official dispatches under their gaze. It won everybody's heart. Botha valued his privacy, but valued the confidence of his burghers still more. He took trouble with everything and everybody. He trusted in God, but left nothing to chance." End quote. If you are looking for an affordable, one-time way to support the show, would you check out our website, the store specifically? There you will see just 2 options right now as of this April of 2021. One of those limited time opportunities is to buy a mask with a Forgotten War logo on it. For just $12 and having to wait a little over a week on shipping and handling, you can support the show and rock some swag for the Forgotten Wars podcast. I will leave the link for you all in the show notes. Now, back to our show. General Buller wrote on December 5th about the situation he believed he was walking into and the prospects of rescuing Lieutenant General White at Ladysmith. Quote, "I am in great doubt how to attack Ladysmith. The main road Colenso goes through, a ghastly country, exactly the sort made for Boer tactics, and they have strongly fortified it. I can turn it by going across the Tugela at Poortheater's Drift, and should have better ground to advance over, but I should not be in so good a tactical position to help White, as I should be if I came up the main road from Colenso. I don't know if I have ever had a problem which has bothered me more." End quote. General Buller ordered the first of 3 frontal attacks in the last of 3 British disasters suffered during Black Week. Botha's force numbered about 4,500 men. Buller had almost 20,000 men at his disposal, but never used his entire force until February 1900. Sun Tzu is believed to have been a Chinese general from some 2,500 years ago. He wrote the famed book on strategy called The Art of War. In Chapter 1, Sun Tzu offers tactical advice that Botha executed. Quote, "Hence, when able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must seem inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe we are far away. When far away, we must make him believe we are near." End quote. As mentioned before, General Louis Botha dug camouflaged trenches as closely as possible to the northern bank of the Tugela River. Very poor scouting and maps led Buller to believe these trenches sat higher up on the hills beyond the river. Botha's Boers had worked hard to confirm Buller's expectations by taking preparations a step further. The Boers dug dummy trenches on the skyline along the hills behind the Tugela where the British could see them. They even placed tree trunks and corrugated iron in these trenches to look like artillery pieces from a distance. Buller began bombarding the Boers on December 13th. Hundreds of Boers had already abandoned Botha before the 13th, when they heard of how huge of a force Buller had, and about Buller's dogged pursuit of Zulu forces 2 decades earlier. For 2 days, Buller's shells struck with the goal of shattering and demoralizing Boer defenses. Many Boers openly contemplated crossing back across the Tugela, away from the British, away from the fortifications they'd spent a month preparing. It took another "fear not the enemy, but fear God" type of telegram from President Creer to convince more Boers to hold their original line in front of the Tugela. Those who remained initially refused to hold defensive positions that were detached from the main Boer defensive line, for fear that the British would encircle and overrun these detached positions. When some Boers finally agreed to defend Hlongwane Hill, Bill Nasson says it was only after drawing lots. Unlike in a couple previous battles, Boers didn't budge for those 2 days. Botha instilled a healthy fear in his remaining men of revealing their true position. General Buller's plan prescribed that Major General Henry Hilliard advance some Brits on the Red Hills in front of Colenso, while Major General Fitzroy Hart lead Irishmen to cross the Tugela and attack what Buller believed to be the Boer left flank. From the right flank, Colonel Earl Dundonald would lead men to support Hilliard's attack. General Neville Littleton and Major General Geoffrey Barton would also lead troops supporting this frontal assault. So basically the plan was to hit the Boers in the mouth and from the back right side. This plan proved terrible. Buller's forces would plod slowly in broad daylight over exposed ground towards Boer defensive positions that still remained largely unknown. At 4:30 a.m., Boers looking alertly into the distance saw the largest British army to take a battlefield in half a century marching towards them. Those Brits were marching on less than 4 hours of sleep. British shells exploded all over the hills near the Boers beginning at 5:20 a.m. But again, the Boers wouldn't flinch for that whole half hour. Then at 6 a.m., Colonel C.J. Long performed another experiment. Colonel Long and his officers had tried this before against the Sudanese in 1898 with success. Rush artillery guns very close to a startled enemy and smash that enemy at close range with shrapnel and explosives. Without any authorization from Buller, or even telling Buller of his plans, Long experimented with this tactic again by moving 18 artillery pieces into position just east of Colenso at 6 a.m. Botha's jaw must have dropped to see artillery used like this, artillery moving far in front of advancing infantry, instead of hanging back behind and firing from the typical greater distances. At 6 a.m., Botha had his howitzer fire its signal shot. Then Long and his company suddenly were engulfed in a hail of rifle and shell fire from waiting Boers. The Boers shot Long and most of his officers off their horses. The artillery crews faced a tough decision: fall back to the British lines a half mile to a mile back, tend to their guns, and be torn apart by the Boer shells. By 7:15 a.m., the British artillery pieces sat abandoned. As the first shots of the Battle of Colenso were fired, a strange procession of volunteers steamed towards the battlefield. The British War Office's ambulances, terribly suited for the stony battlefield, needed some backup. So General Buller recruited body snatchers, volunteer stretcher bearers. This motley crew included Uitlander refugees from Johannesburg and 800 Indians living in Natal. One of those stretcher bearers with a name that would be remembered around the world far more than Paul Creer, Redvers Buller, Louis Botha, or Joseph Chamberlain. That stretcher bearer practiced law in Durban and announced that the Indian community in Durban wanted to express their loyalty to the British Empire by serving as stretcher bearers. Mohandas Gandhi and the other stretcher bearers would have a lot of work to do at Colenso. When Major General Hart followed an inaccurate map and led his men into a loop of the Tugela River, the Boers lit them up from three sides. Caught in a devil of a mess, in Buller's words, these Irishmen charged Boer lines over and over again, and the Boers mowed these Irishmen down over and over again. In 30 minutes, 400 of these Irishmen were dead or wounded. General Buller demanded these Irishmen withdraw at 7:30 a.m. Buller then rushed forward to see what he could do about Colonel Long's stranded guns. Buller was riding fearlessly through gun and shell fire when a shell exploded near him. A doctor urgently asked Buller if he was all right, and Buller calmly said that the wind had just been knocked out of him, when in fact his ribs had been severely bruised. Buller ordered the rescue of the 18 abandoned British artillery pieces. Colonel Long's men did salvage 6 of these guns successfully, but Buller asked for more volunteers to save the remaining dozen guns. The son of one of Buller's arch-rivals stepped up. Lieutenant Frederick Roberts, yes, the only son of Field Marshal Lord Roberts, that leader of the Roberts Ring. Roberts, the son, had failed the Staff College entrance exam by a record margin. Field Marshal Roberts then begged his arch-rival, Sir Garnet Wolseley, to make an exception and admit young Frederick Roberts to the Staff College. Not surprisingly, Wolseley refused. The only way for Freddie Roberts to earn entrance into the Staff College would be through some sort of gallantry on the battlefield. So on that morning at Colenso, Lieutenant Roberts and some other volunteers rushed through gunfire to try to save the remaining 12 British artillery pieces. Captain Walter Congreve rode off alongside Lieutenant Roberts. Congreve gave the following account after, quote, "All we could see were little futs of dust all over the ground, a whistling noise, kaput, where they hit, and an increasing rattle of musketry somewhere in front. My first bullet went through my left sleeve, and just made the point of my elbow bleed. Next, a clod of earth caught me no end of a smack on the other arm. Then my right got one, then my right leg, my horse another, and that settled the question. He plunged, and I fell off about 100 yards from the guns we were going to." End quote. Freddie Roberts vanished. Only 2 of the guns were saved. For this saving, 7 brave Brits earned a Victoria's Cross for their actions. One of them received this honor posthumously. That fallen man was Lieutenant Roberts. Field Marshal Lord Roberts would never forgive Buller for losing his son in this Battle of Colenso. Dundonald attacked what turned out to be the Boers' weakest spot, but even this thin line of Boers fought so fiercely that Dundonald got orders at noon to turn back. In the end, just as Buller was about to lead Brits held in reserve into battle, Buller thought better of it and recalled all supplies and men. He couldn't bear to see his men suffer any more than they already had, or risk losing more of his Natal force. Buller met utter disaster in his first battle, sustaining over 1,100 British casualties, while Botha's men only saw 8 of their men die in battle and only 30 sustain wounds. So less than 5% of the casualties suffered by the Brits. Some South African newspapers referred to the Battle of Colenso as the Second Machuba. Afterwards, General Buller told Lieutenant General White in Ladysmith something that would haunt Buller long after. Either hold on for another month, or, if that isn't possible, fire off as much ammunition as possible, and then accept the best peace terms possible. Buller's British enemies would have a field day with these messages. I have yet another limited time announcement for you on this July 23rd, 2021. If you'd like to hear about this truly fascinating and extraordinary man, Louis Botha, I have great news for you. Rather than letting the 20 or so books that I used to help me write this season of Forgotten Wars just sit in storage or on a shelf forever, I'm going to be mailing those books to loyal listeners like you. I read Richard Stein's book, Louis Botha, A Man Apart, to help prepare for this episode 1.30 and other episodes. If you're hearing this announcement, then you have the opportunity to win Louis Botha, A Man Apart, by doing something free and simple. First, share episode 1.3 of the show via email or on social media. If you'd like an example of text you could use to share episode 1.3, check out this episode's show notes. It would go something like, want to learn about the Boer Wars and other clashes that ravaged South Africa after European settlement? Then start with episode 1.3 of the Forgotten Wars podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and most other places you find podcasts. Next, when people reply to your email or react to your share on social media, take a screenshot. Finally, send me a screenshot of your share with the accompanying responses you got from people. The first person to send me a screenshot that meets this criteria will get the Louis Botha, A Man Apart book mailed at my expense to them with a note of gratitude. Again, I will mail the book for free to the winner. Once I've got a winner, I will erase this announcement promptly. All right, share episode 1.3. It's a win-win.